All right, good afternoon and welcome to the third and final external webinar for the 2022 Spring Hydrologic Outlook. I'm Joe Cibulka. I'm one of the hydrologists here at the National Water Center, and I'm going to start the presentation today by giving a general overview and update of the Spring Hydrologic Outlook for the Greater Mississippi, Source River, Red River of the North, and Great Lakes Basins. After that, we will hear from representatives from each of the 5 river forecast centers for more detailed information on the flood potential for their respective regions. This webinar is being recorded and a follow-up email will be sent with information on how to access the recording. Should you have any questions during the presentation, please go ahead and type it into the question box in the GoToWebinar GUI, and we will address it at the conclusion of the presentations. So let's get started this afternoon by taking a look at the winter precipitation so far across the Greater Mississippi Basin and how that compares to last year. A couple differences can be seen comparing this year in that center graphic and last year shown in that graphic on the right. The most noticeable of these differences is across the northern plains and into the mid-Mississippi Valley and then into the Ohio Valley there, where you can see the blue and green colors in that center graphic. These regions have seen above normal precipitation for this 2022 winter season so far. So this is pretty different from last year in those particular regions. However, across the remainder of the Mississippi Basin, we are drier than last year. So we're seeing those deeper yellows and oranges indicating below normal precipitation for the season so far. And then if we shift our focus to the graphic on the left, showing the precipitation over the last 2 weeks, you can see that the recent wet pattern continued the trend of above normal precipitation over the mid-Mississippi and Ohio valleys, as indicated by those blue colors. And we did also see a period of wet weather over the past 2 weeks across portions of Wisconsin and then into the UP of Michigan as well. And if we move on to our next slide and take a look at temperatures, in the graphic on the left, again looking at the last 2 weeks, northern and western portions of the basin have also seen cooler than average temperatures. And then contrary to that, warmer than average temperatures have melted most remaining snow across eastern portions of the basin, which we'll take a look at on the next slide. And then seasonally this year in the center graphic, it is almost a flipped image from last year, which you see on the right. And this year is much colder across the northern plains, but warmer across the remainder of the basin, with departures from mean ranging generally in that 2 to 4 degree range. And so next we'll take a look at the snow water equivalent that we are holding on to across the basin heading into this spring. So just how much water is being held in that current snowpack. So on the left, you'll see both the current SWE graphics, snow water equivalent, as well as the snow water equivalent graphic from 2 weeks ago. So comparing these two images, snow water equivalent amounts are generally the same, with a little bit of melt that occurred over the past weekend across portions of central Minnesota and Wisconsin there. But overall, compared to this time last year, which you see on the graphic on the right, we have a good bit more of snow water equivalent across the upper Midwest and into the Great Lakes. And Mike from NCRFC will go more into what this means for flooding in that region later in the presentation. So now if we look at soil moisture across the basin, there hasn't been a whole lot of change in the last 2 weeks. And compared to last year, soil moisture content is elevated across the mid-Mississippi, Ohio, and Tennessee valleys, which does coincide well with those areas of above average precipitation we saw earlier in the slides. Also across portions of the eastern Dakotas and far western Minnesota, there were a couple of rounds of late season precipitation before the winter freeze, which locked in some more saturated soils across that region. But we are looking at a very different story, however, across the upper Missouri. This area saw a prolonged dry period leading into the winter, and as we saw earlier, has received little precipitation over the winter season. And then areas of lower soil moisture content can also be seen across portions of the Central Plains and the Arkansas Red and lower Mississippi valleys, which takes us to our next slide. All right, so this is the most recent U.S. Drought monitor, which was updated this morning. And across most of the western portions of the greater Mississippi Basin, widespread dry conditions and even areas of extreme drought are present, which is different from last year, where we were only seeing some isolated pockets of abnormally dry areas and severe drought going into the spring season. Then taking a look at our stream flows across the basin, this is the USGS 7-day average stream flow map. And across the mid-Mississippi and into the Ohio Basin there, average stream flows for the past 7 days are above normal to even much above normal in some local basins, which is an expected increase from that precipitation that we saw over the past couple weeks. But this is a difference from last year, where northern portions of the Ohio Basin were experiencing near normal to below normal 7-day average stream flows. And then across the remainder of the Mississippi Basin, with the exception of some of those areas highlighted on the drought monitor, stream flows are generally normal to slightly above normal, seen in those green shades there. And then you'll notice the white sections in the upper Midwest and northern plains. That's where we're either iced in or some of the seasonal gauges are not taking measurements at this time. Then moving on to the next slide here, this information comes from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers Detroit District. Elevated water levels can have an impact on flooding of inland streams and rivers, so we did want to highlight this. And this outlook is based off the March 6-month forecast, which forecasts for the months between March and August. And besides Lake Superior, all lakes are currently above their long-term average levels. However, our forecasts remain well below record high levels moving into the spring and summer. And then switching gears a little bit, we are going to look at the precipitation and temperature forecasts and climate outlooks that will influence our hydrologic river outlooks into the spring. So the majority of the precipitation seen here on this 7-day graphic will fall to the southeast of the greater Mississippi Basin, with only negligible amounts of precipitation across the entire basin over the next 7 days. Rivers across the mid to lower Mississippi, Tennessee, and Ohio valleys, some are rising or already at minor to isolated moderate flood stage, and many of these points will remain elevated into next week as those flood waves continue to route through the system. Minor flooding will continue over portions of the lower Mississippi River during the next couple of weeks, with crests on the lower Mississippi River main stem not being significantly impacted by this rainfall over the next 7 days or so. And now if we move on to the week 2 outlook from the Climate Prediction Center, there is an increased probability of above normal temperatures across the majority of the basin, particularly across central and northern portions of the basin. And then for the precipitation in week 2 on the right there, the Ohio Valley region and Great Lakes regions are leaning towards slightly above normal probabilities for precipitation, while southern and western portions of the basin are leaning towards more near normal or even below normal probabilities for precipitation. And then looking further out at the latest seasonal outlooks taking us through May, there hasn't been a whole lot of change since the previous webinar, with probabilities continuing to favor above normal temperatures across the majority of the country. And then probabilities also show that the above normal precipitation chances will continue in the mid-Mississippi and Ohio Valley regions, which will be important to watch as these basins, as you saw the past few slides, are a bit vulnerable to additional flooding given the recent conditions. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to Jim Knoll from the Ohio River Basin to go into more depth on the potential of spring flooding across that region.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. And if we go on to the next slide, one thing I do want to highlight is that over the last 30 days in the Ohio Valley, normal is about 2 to 3 inches of rain. We've had anywhere from 2 to 8 inches of rainfall. So as it was shown earlier, way above normal precipitation here in the Ohio Valley. We've had several flood events really over the last 30 to 40 days here in the Ohio Valley. And this is reflected by this image here showing the ongoing minor flooding across portions of Ohio, Indiana, eastern Illinois, down into western Kentucky. We expect that flooding to continue to linger really into portions of next week. It'll begin to subside some. And as was shown, over the next week, not too active here in the Ohio Valley, but it does look to get more active in weeks 2 and 3. And so we do expect some more flooding to probably be returning to the basin as we move through the second half of the month. One thing is we do expect a snow event here later this week, later tomorrow and into the beginning of the weekend. But we really don't think the snow water equivalent from that will really impact our hydrologic conditions very much. So going forward, it's mainly a rainfall that will be driving our flood events through the rest of March into April and portions of early May. So if we move on to the next slide, this is the 50% or greater chance map here for the Ohio Basin. And so we're expecting at least minor to moderate flooding to continue on and off through April, and probably early May is probably my best estimate of when things will begin to relax in the Ohio Basin as our weather patterns shift gradually to the north. So we are expecting minor to moderate flooding, especially as that precipitation graphic showed from our Climate Prediction Center, really focusing on Ohio, Indiana, portions of Illinois, and Kentucky. That seems to be, we're able to focus it down a little bit more now than say a month ago, as the events start to take shape a little bit more into the western half of our basin. Moving on to the next slide, we do like to look at the 25% chance because generally after about a week out, we generally look at the possible outcomes, and usually we look at the 25 or 30% chance for that. And this is a pretty good representation based on future rainfall of what we're looking at, the more real possibility of what that risk is. And so you can see kind of scattered minor to moderates, and maybe even a few majors across the basin, especially in the western half of the basin. So again, I can't say that we won't see any major flooding. I think I would classify it right now as isolated major flooding as possible. It'll really come down to where those heavy rain events set up and if they train or repeat over the same areas. So if we move on to the next slide and kind of zoom in just a little bit more on the details for the Ohio Basin, we'll kind of break it down from north and south. For the northern basin, for eastern Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, western Pennsylvania, and southwest New York, we do expect minor flooding in the Maumee, the Embera, Little Wabash, and Skillet Fork in portions of Indiana, Illinois. And then moderate flooding in the East Fork of the White River Basin, the Wabash, and the Patoka Basin over the next, again, I'm thinking 45 to 60 days is kind of our flood season right now here. After earlier mid-May, things should begin to wind down. Further to the east in Ohio, we do expect minor flooding in the Maumee, the Great Miami, the Scioto, and Muskingum Basin, as well as the Lake Erie drainages, all of the smaller rivers up in north central and northeast Ohio draining into Lake Erie. We do expect minor to even moderate flooding in the Beaver River Basin. And again, even though we don't show any flooding in western Pennsylvania and southwest New York, that's because the probability is less than 50%, but the reality is that there is a possibility of at least some minor flooding in the Allegheny River Basin over the next, again, 45 to 60 days. Moving on to the next slide and traveling further south of the Ohio River, we do expect minor flooding in the state of Kentucky in the Green, the Kentucky, the Licking, Cumberland river basins, which really covers the good portion of the state of Kentucky. Again, I can't rule out isolated moderate flooding in the state of Kentucky, depending on how these future heavy rainfall events occur. Further to the east in West Virginia, we do expect some minor flooding in the upper portion of the Monongahela Basin. One other thing I want to highlight too is because of all the heavy rain events over the last 30 to 45 days, our pool levels on a lot of the reservoirs throughout the Ohio Basin are elevated right now, especially in Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky. They are above normal winter pools, but the Army Corps of Engineers is working hard to get those pools down to more normal levels. And so that will likely occur over the next week. So we should have enough time before any of the next heavy rainfall events to see most of those pool levels return pretty close to where we would expect them to be for the winter time. So we have plenty of flood storage by the Army Corps of Engineers within our basin. For the Ohio River, we do expect minor flooding, at least a 50% chance of minor flooding below Louisville, Kentucky on the Ohio. But again, about a 25% chance of minor to isolated moderate flooding really is possible along the entire main stem of the Ohio for the next 45 to 60 days. So if we move on to the final slide here for the Ohio and Cumberland basins, the flood risk is still considered above normal. So not a lot has changed from a few weeks ago when we talked last, but we are being able to focus a little bit better on the states of Ohio, Indiana, Eastern Illinois, and Kentucky, where the greatest flood threat risk is right now. Flooding in the Eastern Basin right now is considered near normal. But again, that doesn't mean that you can't get flooding. It just means that the magnitude, the severity, the extent of it would be probably less than in the Western Basin. So again, our focus right now for minor to moderate flooding through late April or early May is really across the Ohio Basin, but really focused in those states of Ohio, Indiana, portions of Illinois, and Kentucky. Again, I can't rule out in other states in the Ohio Basin, but those are the ones I'm really focused on right now. And again, we've already had significant floods here in the Ohio Basin, has been talked about already, really over the last month and a half, and that's not uncommon. Our peak flood season in the Ohio Basin is usually peaks out in March, and then we have flooding really that can begin as early as January and February, and then persist as late as usually about early mid-May. Things begin to wind down. And finally, rainfall and future thunderstorms will be those main contributors going forward. We're not too worried anymore about any snow water equivalent here in the Ohio Basin. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Mike now at the North Central Rivers Forecast Center.
Thank you, Jim, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to talk about the North Central River Forecast area across the upper Midwest here. So on my first slide, I'm going to talk about recent precipitation. So since our last outlook in the mid part of February, our region up here has seen a couple of significant storm systems move through. This is an image of precipitation over the last 2 weeks or so. The latter half of February saw additional snowfall in the Dakotas and across parts of Minnesota and Wisconsin into the upper peninsula of Michigan, and that added more water content to the landscape. Further south, that same storm complex brought very warm temperatures and also some significant rainfall. The warm weather caused rapid snowmelt, and the rainfall only added to the runoff, and some flooding was the result, reaching from Missouri and Illinois up through lower Michigan. Then another large storm system moved through just this past weekend, and that one brought another round of warm temperatures and rain, but this time it surged all the way north up into Minnesota and Wisconsin. Some heavy rain amounts of 1 to 2 inches were seen up here. These events also caused rapid river rises as well as some flooding. And as the river levels rose due to all this runoff, the ice in the waterways broke up and then moved downstream. And in some cases, that ice caused ice jamming when it got hung up on sharp bends in the river or other obstructions such as bridge crossings and downed trees. Some of the ice jams did result in significant flooding in a few locations. Much of that now has diminished, so we're glad to hear about that. So how much snow was left after all this? We're going to look at that on the next slide. This first image is going to be a quick look of where we were 2 weeks ago. And note that the snow water content is confined mostly to the north. And we did see this graphic a little bit earlier when Joe was starting out this presentation. On the next slide, we'll look at where we are today. And as you can see, it is very similar to 2 weeks ago, really. There's very little snow across our southern areas. There is a band still lingering from northern Missouri and eastern Iowa over to lower Michigan or so from last weekend's storm, but that's melting quickly and it has really little in the way of water content that we're concerned with. The most snow water content continues to be up across the north. The Souris Basin in North Dakota, the Red River Basin, parts of northern Minnesota and northern Wisconsin, and into the upper peninsula of Michigan. And that's the area that we're still having quite a bit of concern about with an enhanced risk for flooding this spring. Snow water content is running 3 to 4 inches from eastern North Dakota into the northern half of Minnesota and also stretching into Wisconsin. Some areas have even more. The tan colors you see there are 4 to 5 inches, and any orange or yellow that you see is in the 5 to as much as 8 inch range. And the greens indicate even more, and up around Lake Superior with 8 to 10 inches of water content or even more in those areas. So what's most concerning to us right now is all that water on the landscape across our far northern areas. So on the next slide, we're going to look at how our computer models handle this. And this one is showing the amount of snow water content that we were using in our model simulations to generate our flood outlook this week. So note that there's very little snow water over the southern half of the service area with all the reds and oranges there. That's very little. But there is a great deal of water on the ground across our north. Eastern North Dakota has a general 3 to 4 inches of water content in the snow, some locations having 5 or even more. Northeast Minnesota, 5 to 6 inches, and as much as 6 to 9 inches up in the upper peninsula of Michigan. On the next slide, we're going to see how that ranks compared to normal, and you can see there's 3 distinct areas that are standing out. First of all, the warmer orange and red colors indicate low snow water content. That's in the lowest quarter of all the years in our comparison history. Less than normal amounts of snow water content, and that runs from northern Iowa across southern Wisconsin into lower Michigan. The next area that we're looking at is that band of blue that runs from southern Iowa and northeast Missouri into parts of Illinois. That's that remnant snow that we just talked about, still lingering in our modeling there. But that's the reason that that's above normal is because they normally don't have much snow there this time of year. The main area that we're still watching closely is further north, and that's that large area of blue that you see from North Dakota and northern Minnesota and stretching into northern Wisconsin. Those areas are ranked in the top 10 or 20% of all years in our historical record for this time in the first week of March. And that indicates snow water content well above average for this time of year. So all of this plays into our flood outlook, which is coming up here on the next slide. And when we put it together, here's the outlook. For the next 90 days across our area, overall, the majority of our region is showing about an average risk of flooding. There's a smattering of locations expected to reach flood stage there with the orange icons, especially along the main stem Mississippi River, as well as the Illinois River. And now that spring rains are soon to be arriving, there's also a chance for a few spots to climb up to moderate levels. And you can see a few red icons mixed in too. But things are different further north up in the Hudson Bay drainage. The Red River of the North and its tributaries really have our attention this year with a good deal of flooding anticipated thanks to all that snow water we looked at just a few minutes ago. All the colored icons up there are indicating widespread areas where flooding has a greater than 50% chance of occurring. The orange icons are primarily minor flooding, but red is indicating flooding reaching moderate, and a purple suggests a greater than 50-50 chance for flooding reaching the major level. So let's zoom in on the Red River Valley here in the next slide. But let's first start with the Souris River, and that's up in north central North Dakota where the arrows are there. The river starts up in southern Canada, moves south, from northwest to southeast from the upper left of the image. Then it drops through Minot, North Dakota, and then it curves back northward into Canada again. So note that the upper portion of the Souris Basin really has no flooding indicated, and that makes sense. There has been a prolonged drought up in that area for a number of years now, and they have limited snow on the ground still currently. But there is quite a bit of snow water further east in the state, and that covers the lower portion of the basin. So if we get that 3 to 4 inches of snow water to melt off quickly enough, we could see some flooding in the lower portion of the Souris Basin. Now back to the Red River and its tributaries on the right side of the image. There is a good deal of water on the ground, as we've seen, and that ranks in that top 10% of the historical record. So if that 3 to 5 inches of water comes off quickly, there's definitely potential for some moderate or even major flooding in these areas, as indicated by those red and purple icons there. So as an example, on the next slide, I'm going to take a look at Fargo, North Dakota. And this is one of the 90-day probabilistic chance graphics that we have. And note that the black line here is shifted well to the left of the blue line. The blue line is the typical historical chance for flooding based on past events going back over 50 years in our record. The black line is the chance for flooding when you take into account the current conditions, such as soil moisture, temperature trends, frozen ground, how much snow we have on the landscape, and things like that. So looking at this example for Fargo, you can see there's a much higher chance for flooding as compared to normal. Looking closely at the numbers, that black line at the 50% line, it's well into the major category with a river stage up around maybe 33 feet or so. And the 90% chance indicates that the river could be over 30 feet, which is the threshold for major flooding there. So we are concerned with that area, as I mentioned. On the next slide, there's a couple other things that can come into play when we're worried about flood risk. And one of them is frost depths. Now the frost depth is too hard to quantify for us to put into our graphics in our outlook chances, but this could play a role, and it's not really reflected. As I said, you can see in this graphic, the darker shades of blue are indicating deeper frost, and the lighter colors have more shallow frost. Frost depths are pretty close to what we saw 2 weeks ago, maybe just a bit further deep in the ground. Grand Forks, North Dakota, up in the northeast part there, the frost depth there was 35 inches on Monday. In Aberdeen, South Dakota, it was 36, and up around Minot, 28 inches. Depths of 18 to 30 inches were pretty common across much of Minnesota and Wisconsin. But then that frost depth, as you can see, really tapers off quickly as you go south. Frost is pretty much out of the ground already south of a line from Omaha to Des Moines to around Detroit. So if you recall, frozen ground, it acts like a barrier, kind of like concrete. So that when the snow does melt, it can't soak into the ground. It has to run off directly into the creeks and rivers. If there's less frost, the ground can thaw quicker, and it allows that melt water to soak in. So with areas with a deeper frost, we're going to have to watch out for rapid melting scenarios. So on the next slide, we'll go through our summary. Overall, our risk this spring is generally about average for much of the region, the exception being the Red River Valley up north, where the risk is above normal. The indication is that in areas where we do see some flooding, most of it's going to be in the minor category, except up in the Red River Valley, where widespread flooding is expected, and some of it could reach moderate or even major levels. So now the outlook for the rest of March is generally warmer for much of our basin. However, it is near normal or even a little below normal as you get close to the border. So temperatures across the northern areas where that snow is in place, if it doesn't warm up enough, the snow could linger. And the longer the snow lingers, the greater the chance that we'll see that rapid warm up finally reach the area. And rapid snowmelt could cause rapid runoff. So we're going to have to watch out for that over the next few weeks. And with that, I'm going to end, and I'll pass it off to Kevin Lau down at the Missouri Basin River Forecast Center.
Thank you, Mike, and good afternoon, everyone. I'll go ahead and start out saying the same thing I've said the past two outlooks, and that is that there is an overall reduced flood risk across the Missouri Basin this spring. So not a whole lot has changed since last outlook. To illustrate, I would invite you to look at the left-hand graphic. The 400 plus forecast locations within the Missouri River Basin are depicted as colored dots on this map. And the color of the dots indicates the percent difference in flood risk for that given location this year as compared to historic. Blue dots indicate a reduction in flood risk as compared to historic. Yellow to orange to red dots indicate an enhanced risk for flooding this year as compared to historic. To aid in the visualization, we've also shaded in larger areas where chances predominate in one direction or the other. As you can see, there are no areas of enhanced flood risk this spring in the Missouri Basin. Maybe a location or two, but no general areas of enhanced risk. Mike showed you a 90-day stage probability plot earlier, and I do the same on the right-hand side here. This location is located in northwest Missouri, and I use it as an example. If you compare where the historic distribution, which is the blue line, if you compare where that crosses the minor flood category against where today's conditional distribution, which is the black line, where it crosses the minor flood category, you can see that there's a 35% reduction in the probability to reach flood stage for this year. And it is these differences that we are plotting on the map to the left. As you can see, there are large areas within the basin where flood risk is reduced anywhere from 10 to as much as 30% in large areas. That's the blue shaded areas. Again, I'll point out there are no areas where enhanced flood risk dominates. Now, a word of caution, reduction or enhancement of flood risk doesn't necessarily mean that we expect a particular location to flood or not to flood. Decreased or increased flood risk simply tells us which direction we're heading. A case in point is the location where the 90-day distribution is shown there on the right-hand graphic. Historically, this location has about an 86% chance of flooding during springtime. However, as we said before, due to the dry conditions, this site now only has a 51% chance of flooding over the next 90 days. So even with a significant reduction in flood risk, we are still outlooking this particular site to flood this spring. In a later slide, I'll pinpoint those basins where flooding is expected this year. But for now, I simply wish to leave you with the notion that flood risk for the coming spring is reduced from normal for most of the Missouri Basin. Going to the next slide, we'll look at the mountains. Mountain runoff is important to the Missouri Basin. It accounts for about 30% of the annual runoff. This graphic, courtesy of the Natural Resources Conservation Service, or the NRCS, shows the mountainous basin snowpack condition in percent of average snow water equivalent. That's the amount of liquid held in the pack. Mountain snowpack can be categorized as being below average this year. By this point in the winter, we've normally accumulated about 80% of the seasonal peak snow water equivalent in the mountains. So we're quickly closing in on the final picture of where the mountain snowpack is going to be. Mountain snowpack conditions then lead us to our next slide. And this slide that we're showing here summarizes the runoff potential that exists for the mountains this year. The Missouri Basin River Forecast Center issues water supply forecasts for about 40 locations. Those are those colored dots you see in the west. Sort of like what the NRCS does, but we use a different method to do our water supply. Our current water supply forecast suggests a much below average mountain runoff year, volumetrically speaking, for the west. And as a side note, I'll also say that significant flooding from mountain snowmelt alone is not expected this year. It'll take a ton of rain to cause any flooding out west. With our next slide, and that's courtesy of the Office of Water Prediction, we see that while plains snow is widespread across the Missouri Basin, it's relatively shallow. The only appreciable plain snow is found in southwest Wyoming and there in the eastern Dakotas. Highest reports being just over 3 inches there in the headwaters of the James River Basin in North Dakota. And now moving to the next slide, we'll show the graph that everyone wants to see. And that is the graph where we believe that there will be flooding this spring. In the James River Basin there in South Dakota, we are expecting minor level flooding, minor to moderate level flooding, I should say, in the Columbia to Stratford Reach. The Little Sioux Basin there in Iowa could see some minor flooding in the upper reach. It's kind of iffy up there. Don't know if it will or not, but there's a chance. And then moving to the lower basin, minor to moderate flooding is expected along many of the tributaries in extreme eastern Kansas and across the state of Missouri. And this is nothing unusual. Thunderstorm activity drives springtime flooding in this area of the basin. In fact, we just experienced minor flooding in the Missouri Ozarks in late February. Just goes to show that we can have flooding any time of the year in the Missouri Basin. With this third spring flood outlook, our 90-day window has now progressed us into early June. And with that move into early summer, we now see a likelihood of experiencing minor flooding along the Missouri River itself in the reach below Kansas City down to the mouth. And again, this is typical. And the likelihood of episodic on-again, off-again flooding along the main stem Missouri downstream of Kansas City is driven by thunderstorm activity that is common in this area for this time of year. And so in summary, for the Missouri River Basin, spring flood risk is lower than normal. Mountain snowpack is less than average. Plain snowpack, for all intents and purposes, is pretty much non-existent. As Mike mentioned, frost depths are impressive In certain areas, we've got 46 inches in Bismarck, 36 in Aberdeen, 22 in Sioux Falls. However, given the drought conditions, we suspect that the soil, while indeed cold, can still absorb some runoff, whether it be from snow melt, where we do have snow, or from future rain events. Now, a possible exception to that would be in the extreme eastern Dakotas, where precipitation that we've received in late fall and over the winter has benefited the soil moisture. It is possible that the available soil moisture was locked into place to produce a frozen ground condition in eastern Dakotas. Generally, dry and mild conditions also lead us to believe that we have an overall lower than normal ice jam breakup flood risk for this season. It's not to say that ice jam flood risk is non-existent. Ice jam induced flooding remains possible in the northern and western areas of the basin for the next few weeks. We don't expect flooding in the west due to mountain snowmelt alone. Flooding in the northern plains is limited to minor to moderate flooding along the middle reach of the James and possibly in the upper reach of the Little Sioux. Thunderstorm activity drives flooding in the lower basin, and so we do expect episodic minor to moderate flooding this spring across eastern Kansas and the state of Missouri. And that also includes the Missouri River itself downstream of Kansas City. Thank you, and with that, I'll now turn it over to James at the Arkansas Red.
Thanks, Kevin. Good afternoon, everyone. Since we started this year's briefings about a month ago, the Arkansas Red Basin continues its recent dryness. So I thought I'd show you what's happened in the last 28 days since we started this year's briefings. The graphic on the left shows the eastern and western portions of the basin have picked up the most precipitation in the last 4 weeks. But really only west central Arkansas has received slightly above normal rainfall for this period. Joe mentioned the drought monitor earlier in the briefing, and as indicated in the graphic on the right, there has been very little improvement in the drought conditions over the past 4 weeks, as you would expect with below normal precipitation. In general, most of the basin remains in severe to exceptional drought. On the next slide, snow water equivalent in the upper Arkansas River Basin in Colorado continues to lag behind normal. Current snow water equivalent for the basin is running at about 89% of normal as determined by the Natural Resources Conservation Service. If you look closely at the graphic on the lower right, you can see much of the deficit was born in December. And since then, snow water equivalent has been following the median curve. It's just been lacking that initial snow water equivalent that didn't accumulate in December. In this area, the snowpack typically reaches a max in the mid to latter half of April. Currently, we do not expect the snowpack to be a significant contributing factor to any potential flooding later this spring in the upper Arkansas River. On the next slide, we show the status of the Corps of Engineers and Bureau of Reclamation reservoirs in our basin with respect to the amount of flood storage available. With the generally dry weather, most reservoirs have most, if not all, of their flood storage available. The exceptions are a few reservoirs in eastern Oklahoma where it rained last weekend, and that runoff was captured by the reservoirs, and the Corps will continue to release that excess water downstream as allowed by any future rainfall and river levels. In both the Arkansas and Red Basins, the Tulsa District reservoirs are using about 2% and 1% respectively of their total storage available. The reservoirs are in good shape to capture any excess runoff we get from future storms. On the next slide, we move to our long-range forecast. You should notice a few more locations with a greater than 50% chance of at least minor flooding have been added. The fact that there are more points now indicating potential flooding than in the past couple of briefings is generally due to the fact that we've extended the model, the 90 days run into June now. Typically, we wouldn't see as many points in moderate, but in looking closer at the NOAA's CFS, the Climate Forecast Service model, we've seen more storms affecting the northeast portion of the basin, indicating the higher chance for moderate flooding. The rivers we are most concerned about include the Neosho and Verdigris rivers in southeast Kansas and northeast Oklahoma, and the Illinois and Poteau rivers in eastern Oklahoma. All of these indicate a greater than 50% chance of flooding. Finally, in summary, we expect to see some flooding on rivers that normally flood each spring, but in general, we continue our outlook for a near normal flood risk across the Arkansas Red Basin. As usual, and has been mentioned in past briefings, in our part of the country, the extent and severity of spring flooding are really predicated on the timing and location of any convective storm systems we may get this time of year. And with that, I'll pass it on to Jeff Groschel at the Lower Mississippi River Forecast Center.
Alrighty, thank you, James. Good afternoon, everyone. As far as the lower part of the Mississippi River, we're still looking about the same conditions and stuff across our area. Well, we've got minor to moderate flooding continuing right now in the lower part of the Ohio River, and cresting conditions are still, I guess, on portions of the lower Mississippi River, kind of above Memphis area right now. We've probably still got another week and a half or so before we get cresting conditions down on the lower part of the river near New Orleans. So, but we also do have some minor flooding in portions of the Black and Arkansas River in Arkansas. And then we had a pretty good amount of 2 to 5 inches of rainfall that occurred a couple of days ago over parts of central Louisiana and central parts of Mississippi. So we do have a little bit of minor flooding going on in the state of Mississippi and stuff on the Big Black and the Pearl rivers themselves. But right now, what we've got on the ground and what we're seeing currently is really seasonal, what we typically have for the month of March. And we'll move to our next slide and talk about the lower part of the Mississippi River and the Atchafalaya. Like I indicated before, we currently do have minor to moderate flooding occurring at this time, but we are starting to see some recessions on the lower part of the Ohio. Kind of the long range models and stuff that we're seeing right now kind of still will keep us in maybe the minor category of flooding on the lower part of the Ohio till about second, third, probably another 2 weeks or so when our indications are that we may go below flood stage in those locations. Certainly that's going to be dependent on any sort of rainfall that we get. As Jim had already mentioned, in weeks 2 and 3, things may get a little bit more active in the Ohio River, so we'll have to watch that very closely. But currently right now, based on what we're seeing on the Ohio, what we see on the Missouri, and what we see on the upper part of the Mississippi, we're really categorizing just average conditions across the lower part of the Mississippi River. So some minor to moderate flooding is what we're indicating for the parts of the lower part of the Mississippi River. The Atchafalaya actually probably will be a little bit less. We've been in drought conditions in that area there, so probably more in the minor category, if anything, for those locations. And then we'll switch to the next slide and talk about the areas, at least in our eastern areas in Tennessee and northern Alabama. Again, just got a little residual minor flooding going on in parts of northern Alabama at this time, but we've had very wet conditions over the last 30 days or so. And actually probably even a little bit longer than that. So a lot of the tributaries that go into the Tennessee River with wet soil moisture conditions, any sort of even just normal rainfall that we get in this area, we do anticipate getting some minor to some isolated moderate flooding over the next several months across this area. And we'll switch to the next slide. For parts of Arkansas and Missouri, we still continue to have minor flooding going on the Black and in the lower parts of the White River basins. And those are the areas that we typically do see flooding at this time. So we are anticipating minor to isolated moderate flooding for those particular locations. Now, further south into the southern parts of Arkansas, the Ouachita has been in pretty good drought. So typically we would see minor to moderate flooding in those locations indicated on the graph here. But based on what we're seeing right now, we're indicating probably just minor flooding for portions of the Ouachita River Basin. And then we'll switch to the next slide. Talk about Louisiana and Mississippi. The eastern portions in Mississippi, we are expecting minor to moderate flooding. We had a pretty good amount of rain that occurred just a couple of days ago across the Big Black and the Pearl River basins and stuff, generating already some minor flooding. And typically those areas do get minor to moderate flooding just about every year. As we go further west, though, into Louisiana, the Ouachita and the Red River basins have been extremely dry for the time of year and pretty persistent drought conditions for those areas. So we're really not anticipating a whole lot in those areas. But as we all know, if we do get any sort of heavier rainfall that may occur in those areas, it wouldn't be surprised if you did get some isolated moderate flooding in those areas. But certainly the soil moisture conditions are dry enough, and certainly starting out, we're really not seeing a lot of flow in those particular rivers at this time. So we'll go to the final slide. We're really looking at our flood risk being above normal, mainly for the Tennessee Valley and the lower part of the Ohio Valley, and near normal to even below normal for portions of the lower Mississippi Valley. Minor to moderate flooding is really what we're anticipating for portions of the lower Mississippi and the lower Ohio River, and also with some isolated moderate flooding for some of the remaining tributaries in the lower Mississippi Valley. And just like others that have already indicated, snowmelt really doesn't cause us any flooding in our area. Certainly it's the rainfall that we get over the next several months that will really indicate what the final outcome of the flood risk will be. And with that, I will turn it back over to Joe from the National Water Center.
All right, thanks for the great summaries, everyone. We'll go through a quick summary slide here. So the flood risk is considered above normal for lower portions of the Ohio Valley and Middle Tennessee Valley. There's an above normal risk for the Red River Valley and the Hudson Bay drainage. Significant flooding due to mountain snow runoff alone is not likely this year. And of course, as others have mentioned, the amount of snow melt and the frequency, intensity, and extent of rainfall will ultimately determine the final outcome in flood risk for this winter and spring season. So thanks for your participation in today's webinar. This is the last scheduled partners webinar of this series before the National Hydrologic Assessment is released next week on March 17th. And this recording will be distributed via email shortly after here. Now we will enter into our question and answer session. And just as a reminder, if you have a question for any of today's presenters, please utilize the question box on the GoToWebinar GUI, and we can answer those questions for you. So I'll give it just a minute here. I see a question. Will the slides be available? Yes, they will be. They should be sent out for everyone's viewing. All right, not seeing any more questions in the question box. So thank you everybody so much for tuning in, and have a great afternoon.